Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. In 2022, a record 57 rocket launches took place at Cape Canaveral, Florida, carrying everything from satellites to astronauts into space. Every launch brings a crowd of local spectators, but we found a pair of eyewitnesses who think they may have captured launch spectators from another planet. January 31st, 2022, a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket launches from Cape Canaveral, Florida, carrying an Italian Earth observation satellite. 200 miles south, a couple watches the launch from Fort Lauderdale. They're following the path of the Falcon 9 with their cell phones, when they notice the rocket is not alone.
Yeah, see those two things?
Two bright white dots of light appear to be following the rocket as it zooms through the atmosphere.
Doesn't it look like it's flying with it?
Yeah, that's going weird, yeah.
Let's zoom in on these things. The lights appear to be orb-shaped, and whether they're part of one craft or two separate craft, they appear to be tracking the rocket. Journalist M.J. Benaya says that rumors began to circulate that whatever they are, they're not of this world.
There's been a lot of speculation online that this is some sort of UFO that is monitoring or surveilling the Falcon 9 launch.
But why would aliens be interested in monitoring one of our rocket launches?
There's been some theories posted online that perhaps they want to keep tabs on our development.
The idea that alien observers track human activity isn't new. Ufologists point to the surge of sightings in the 1940s that coincided with the birth of the atomic bomb. It's estimated the year 1947 saw at least 1,000 UFOs over the United States alone. Now, with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin stepping up their launch schedules, could ETs be taking note? If so, Benaya says it's not the first time.
Another incident was from 2021 on the crewed mission to the ISS that was launched by SpaceX. And people online were pointing to pieces of footage where there was some sort of little object following the main capsule.
As part of the Falcon 9 rocket separated from the spacecraft, a spherical object flew through the gap in a close call heard round the internet.
People were saying that these are indications of alien activity. So it's a big subculture within the UFO community at large of people who kind of monitor live feeds from rocket launches and NASA missions and whatnot, and assert that this is evidence of some sort of alien research or surveillance.
So, is Earth just one of the exhibits on display in some alien civilization's galactic zoo? Well, scientists estimate there could be about 100 billion other planets in our galaxy alone. So it's reasonable to assume we aren't alone in the universe. But does this video prove we're being watched? Let's see what our experts have to say. Aviation and military expert Tim McMillan agrees. There's something strange about this footage.
They're looking at a rocket as it leaves the Earth's atmosphere. You would expect to see what we're seeing there. However, you wouldn't expect to see other bright objects appear in close proximity to it. I could certainly see why that would look like a UFO.
But is it a UFO?
I think even though certain aspects look very odd, they're all man-made objects, and they're all associated with the Falcon 9 rocket launches. So we're not looking at a UFO, we're not looking at any alien technology or anything like that.
McMillan thinks these two lights may be rocket boosters, which separate from the rocket after their fuel has been depleted to minimize dead weight.
That type of debris is going to burn up as it's coming down, or you're just seeing the reflection off of it. So it may look brighter or larger than it really is.
But astronomer Mark D'Antonio begs to differ with McMillan's space trash theory.
These objects that we see here, they're not physical objects in the rocket stream. It's actually an artifact of the rocket plume. That's a low pressure zone beneath that rocket exhaust, and it's going to be subject to atmospheric changes. And those effects are the creation of these little tiny shock waves right here in the atmosphere.
D'Antonio shows us that you don't need a rocket launch to illustrate this same phenomenon in action. Natural turbulence can create the same effect.
A tornado is a very violent place. And as that funnel is twisting, you see that little transient white thing that appeared? What was that? That was an atmospheric effect caused by the tornadoes. Keep in mind that a rocket launch is going to produce similar effects. Among them, these two little supersonic shock waves that we see there from the location.
Our verdict, supersonic shock waves. D'Antonio's explanation of the atmospheric physics seals the deal. More and more rockets are being sent into space every year. So it looks like for now, we don't have to worry about being on display for aliens. We just have to bone up on our rocket tech and learn to recognize these shock waves when we see them. And now we move from the launch pad to the Vatican. There are many rumors about what's buried deep within the estimated 16 million pages of documents in the Vatican secret archives. Some are claiming these archives also include shocking videos. And this next clip is their alleged proof. We are not convinced this footage is real, but we're certain it is disturbing. It's August 2019. A strange video said to be filmed in Auray, France, starts making the rounds on the internet. It's rumored to be footage that was discovered in the Vatican, and you can see why. A brief black and white clip shows a woman in a plaid dress climbing a brick wall with one arm, while dragging a woman in a dark dress up by her hair in the other. When the creepy wall climber gets close to the top, she dangles the frightened, struggling woman for a few seconds before dropping her to the ground as the video suddenly cuts off. What gets me is this moment. Let's freeze it right here. The woman in the plaid dress isn't just climbing up the wall with superhuman strength, she is doing it with one hand. How on earth is that possible? Catholic miracle researcher Michael O'Neill says the internet lit up with claims that this woman was possessed by the devil.
In the Gospels, we have 12 or more cases where Jesus casts out a demon. In one, Mark chapter 5, he encounters Legion. And in that case, the person who's possessed exhibits such strength that no chains can control him.
According to the Bible, Legion refers to a group of demons who collectively possess the man, but are exorcised by Jesus and turned into pigs that then drown. But there are modern possession stories too. In 2012, 3 children in Gary, Indiana were said to walk up walls, levitate, and speak in demonic voices. This strange behavior continued until a local Catholic priest performed a series of exorcisms.
The Catholic Church acknowledges demonic possession as a real phenomenon and actually has a rite of exorcism that's carried out in dioceses all over the United States and around the world. Father Gabriel Amorth, who is perhaps the most famous modern exorcist, claimed to have done over 1,000 exorcisms during his lifetime. Exorcisms have even been done by popes.
And the number of priests performing exorcisms is on the rise. According to one source, in 2005, there were only a dozen in the U.S. Today, there are around 150. So could there be hidden examples of demonic possession in the Vatican's vault?
All kinds of crazy things are claimed to be in there. UFO evidence, things that might debunk church teaching, and also a time machine that supposedly could take you back to the time of the crucifixion.
Only thoroughly vetted scholars are allowed access to the Vatican's secret archives, and to enter, they must get through Swiss Guard security. The researchers can view a maximum of 3 pre-requested documents a day. They are not allowed to photograph anything and must re-request access every 6 months. With that kind of security, it seems it would take a real heist to leak this footage if it's stored there. We'll leave it to our experts to sniff out any culprits. First, emergency medicine physician Dr. Ed Hope analyzes if it's even possible for a person to climb a wall one-handed, as seen in the clip.
The wall is probably much harder to climb than most rocks. She's also only climbing with one hand. She has to let go with her hand to then be able to extend it to climb higher up. You'd expect her probably just to fall off the wall.
So the woman's climbing technique seems highly improbable. But could a rush of adrenaline make this achievable? Here's a theory: some accounts of possession can be attributed to hysterical strength, where the body's stress response triggers this hormone.
Whenever we're in a stressful situation, we secrete adrenaline into our bloodstream. This sends more blood supply to the muscles. It also makes more oxygen available, so it increases your heart rate and your respiratory rate. But adrenaline only goes so far. It's not suddenly going to increase your muscle mass, improve your tendons, or give you climbing technique enough to suddenly scale a building.
Then could this actually be a demonic possession? Dr. Hope wonders, is it even possible to be physically or psychologically possessed?
In medieval times, mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and physical illnesses such as epilepsy were often diagnosed as demonic possession. So that's thankfully largely been replaced as our medical knowledge has increased. And if someone was demonically possessed, they're still working within the physical boundaries of the human body.
With Dr. Hope doubting this video's authenticity, can forensic video analyst Michael Primo help us figure out if it's truly legit?
Geometric shadow analysis was applied to specific areas of the image where we see shadows. And you can see here that there's shadows coming from this direction, which is the primary light source. But the way that the light is coming in and down in this direction, it's inconsistent. You know, light can't produce two different shadows if we're to assume this is a natural primary light source being the sun. These shadows were fabricated.
Primo concludes this scene must have been composited with CGI, using techniques to make it look old.
This appears to be a high-quality image, something that would have been produced from a high-definition camera. Being that it was black and white, this was most likely a filter that was applied to try to demonstrate that this happened some time ago. The general size of the video is inconsistent with older technology that would have produced a black and white video resolution.
Our verdict? This video was made with CGI. While the mysterious Vatican archives are very real, this video just isn't. If you're a regular viewer, then you are probably aware of the alarming number of weird creatures and carcasses that seem to turn up on Russian soil. This next story is the latest and will most certainly not be the last. September 2015, Sosnovy Bor, Russia. In an urban corridor built in 1958 for workers at the Leningrad nuclear power plant, two local residents wade into the shallows of the Kavashi River, where they discover something otherworldly. A tiny creature which appears to have an elongated skull, shrunken frame, and taloned limb. In order to find out more, the local residents christened the creature Kesha and handed it over to a biologist. Field researcher Ken Gerhardt takes a look at this tiny monstrosity.
This is really freaky and weird. Russian scientists were unable to identify this particular carcass, which led to some remarkable speculation. Is it possible that we could be looking at some type of alien creature? A juvenile of some strange species, perhaps? A fetus of something not of this earth?
What seems like a wild theory might not be so far-fetched. This exact area where the creature was discovered is known to be a hotbed of strange UFO sightings and activity.
As recently as February of this year, the airports around St. Petersburg were actually shut down due to reports of a UFO entering Russian airspace. And in one notable incident from 1977, in the nearby city of Petrozavodsk, there was this giant luminous object that was reported by many of the locals. And according to the eyewitness testimony, it actually shot down these beams of light or radiation from the sky onto the earth below. This is a pretty famous incident in terms of Russian UFO history.
The physical appearance of the specimen is not unlike previous descriptions of alien visitors specific to Russia, many of whom bear resemblance to the infamous Greys.
Many of the Russian alien accounts describe these humanoid creatures with huge craniums and spindly bodies with long limbs. And that certainly reminds me of this image that we're looking at here, and it certainly fits within the paradigm of Russian UFO lore.
But while some believe it's an alien, others think it's a mutation from right here on Earth.
A lot of this has to do with the Leningrad nuclear power plant. According to the former Russian inspector for nuclear and radiation safety, Vladimir Kuznetsov, this particular plant has a long tradition and history of cover-ups involving all manner of nuclear and radioactive accidents.
Two such incidents occurred in 1992 and 2009, where massive amounts of radiation were leaked into the surrounding environment, causing many to draw comparisons between the plant in Leningrad and Chernobyl.
If we look at the Chernobyl nuclear accident site, it's been documented that some of the animals in that area have actually begun to undergo different types of mutations and genetic changes. So it's not impossible that this strange creature could actually be the result of some terrible nuclear accident at the Leningrad nuclear power plant.
In a previous episode, we discussed another alleged Russian alien fetus known as Alyoshenka, which was also discovered under bizarre circumstances in an area near a nuclear disaster. It remains unidentified to this day. Will our experts be able to determine what was found this time in Leningrad? Let's find out. Biologist Shay Steingass explains how one would even go about determining if this was an alien life form or not.
The first thing we would probably do is look for genetic material in this animal. If this animal did have genetic material, we would probably deduce that this is actually an earthly animal of some kind.
Scientists have discovered that all living things on Earth share some of the same exact DNA, proving that we all have descended from one common ancestor. Any alien life forms would potentially be missing this universal DNA. But unfortunately, this creature's carcass was sent to Moscow, and the Russians have remained tight-lipped about any DNA testing.
Until we get those results back, we won't really know what exactly we're looking at.
Wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka believes we are looking at a deformity of some kind.
I think it's some sort of deformity because it doesn't look fully developed. The head tends to look honestly kind of fish-like, and it almost seems like there's a hoof. It looks like it's in the position of a fetus. It doesn't go along with the fetuses of different animals that we know. There's something wrong here.
So, could this be the mutated result of toxins from the nearby nuclear power plant?
There is a high possibility that this deformity could be a result of contamination. When you have a developing fetus, your cells are constantly dividing. When cells are replicating, they're more vulnerable to the radiation. So it does make sense that radiation could have caused developmental problems like this.
Our verdict? Unknown fetus. We like Manka's nuclear radiation theory, but we just don't have the DNA to prove it. If that information exists, the Russians are keeping it under lock and key. Makes you wonder what they're scared to reveal. But if and when Moscow decides to release those results, we'll be the first to let you know. There are holes in the depths of our understanding. And as it turns out, there are holes in the depths of the ocean floor, too. So where exactly did the series of holes in this next clip come from? And what do they mean? It's July 2022, and the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is exploring the submerged Mid-Atlantic Ridge, or MAR. It's part of the longest mountain range in the world. As the researchers sink to the depths, journalist Eric Grunhauser says they spy a strange sight.
The really amazing thing that you're seeing is this perfectly straight series of holes or indentations that don't even look circular, but instead look rectangular or oblong.
Take a closer look. This uniformly spaced out trail of small holes looks like someone created it. If so, how did the person get down here? This site is about 1.5 miles below sea level. At that depth, the pressure on a diver would be equal to an elephant stepping on your big toe. So Grunhauser says, some suggest this might be evidence of some kind of covert operation.
Is it possible that these odd holes are actually the remnants, the leftover patchwork of a former military base or a secret underwater laboratory?
We know the U.S. Navy has a deep water facility in the Bahamas to test underwater vehicles and weapons, but maybe there are undercover bases hidden from the public that the government uses to conduct espionage or highly classified weapons tests. Author Jason Martell says others wonder if these holes could have a more otherworldly origin, such as a kind of alien craft known as a USO, an unidentified submerged object.
Maybe something has landed at the bottom of the seabed, and these are the actual imprints left from this technological craft.
The U.S. Navy has documented numerous encounters with alleged USOs that reportedly fly in the air and then dive underwater. Most recently, this now famous 2019 incident in the Pacific recorded by the USS Omaha.
What was splashed?
But others suggest this pattern was created by an unidentified sea creature.
We have to wonder if these aren't created by a pod of beak whales. We know that beaked whales poke holes in the sand searching for their prey.
Yet, these holes seem like they would be too small to be made by a whale, so perhaps they're from some yet undiscovered beast. Home to thousands of species and running north to south from the Arctic to the lower tip of Africa, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is about 10,000 miles long. Yet it's not done growing. The ridge spreads about an inch a year. With such a large reach, it still holds so many unsolved mysteries. Will our ocean holes remain one of them? Geologist Dr. Bob Anderson looks into whether these holes could be the result of man-made technology.
There are a lot of not just cables across the ocean floor, but piping for oil companies. And this looks like it could be something man-made, where the cable is coming up to the surface and you can see parts of it.
However, Anderson says there is a big but.
If it was an active gas line, you would believe to be seeing active all the time because the gas would be flowing through the pipes. But you don't see that.
So what about a man-made or alien-made underwater structure? Marine biologist Dr. Shay Steingass sinks that theory.
If this were the remnants of some mysterious underwater lab, I think we'd see more elements to it than just these small series of holes here. As it is, this seems like a relatively small feature.
Steingass also takes a bite out of this having anything to do with marine life feeding habits.
There are some kinds of animals, like beaked whales, that use suction feeding to actually suck their prey out of the ocean substrate. And I would say that's pretty unlikely because of the formation of these particular structures.
Here you can see what scientists believe are the markings left by a beaked whale on the seafloor. The tracks are not as rectangular or as evenly arranged as the straight line of divots in the mar. So if these uncanny ocean holes do not originate from man, nor beast, nor alien, what's left? Anderson says the answer is the Earth itself.
When you have these tectonic plates that are shifting and moving, they could cause little fissures opening up. And when that happens, these gases trapped inside these areas get released pretty fast.
The release of the gases creates a void into which the sediment above collapses. When pit craters form along a fissure or fracture lines, they can develop into what's known as a pit chain.
The pit chain usually are big enough where people can go into them. They're like caves into the ground. These are like miniature pit chains.
Our verdict? We will lean on Anderson and call these ocean fissures that have created mini pit chains. Similar pit chains have been discovered on Mars and other neighboring celestial bodies. And because our oceans can have similar conditions to those on other planets, we are able to see a little bit of cosmic wonder right here on Earth. Antenna. They are all around us. Radio, TV, cell towers. Just another part of the modern landscape, right? But when they pop up in off-limit places and nobody knows who put them there or why, you can bet we'll be tuning in to investigate. January 2023. It is a crisp winter day in the Wasatch Mountains around Salt Lake City, Utah. A group of hikers is taking in the scenic views when they come across something peculiar on the trail ahead. They take out their cameras and get a snapshot of this. It's a 6-foot-tall fiberglass antenna attached to what appears to be a solar panel and a battery pack, none of which feature any official markings or indication that this antenna is supposed to be here. But what's even stranger, it's not alone. According to journalist MJ Banias, about a dozen of these antennae have been found scattered throughout the mountain ranges of Salt Lake City.
The Salt Lake City Department of Public Lands has no idea who put them there. No one has filed for a permit to put these towers up, so it's definitely a bit of a mystery.
Authorities began to speculate about what this could be.
One of the theories is that these devices are what we call a stingray. A stingray is basically a device that is able to trick your cell phone into thinking that it's speaking to a cell tower when in fact it's speaking to one of these antennae. If that happens, the stingray is able to collect data off of your phone, record phone calls, look at text messages, anything that's sent over the network, and essentially a person tries to use their phone, it connects to the criminal stingray, and that criminal is able to then collect data.
If these are stingrays, who could be the target? Banias notes one of the country's most vital intelligence organizations, the National Security Agency, is known to operate a large data center near Salt Lake City.
We know from a 2016 report that came out that that specific facility in Utah is hacked as much as 300 million times a day by foreign hacker groups or local hacker groups trying to extract information. So there's a lot of interest in the NSA's facility there, both from outside powers as well as internal groups that just simply want to have access to that information.
This isn't the first time a mysterious object has popped up in Utah. You may remember we previously covered the story of this large, shiny silver pillar. Many speculated it was of alien origin. We determined it was likely an art installation or hoax. But this antenna looks more practical and, frankly, a little scarier. Let's see if our experts can put our mind at ease. We asked physicist Michio Kaku, could this be a stingray?
I don't see anything like that here. Nothing that sophisticated. You have a solar panel, but they're very cheap. You can even make an antenna by yourself. And there's a power supply and a processor that you can get off the shelf at an electronics store. If I was an agent wanting to eavesdrop on American military facilities, I would want a much more powerful device here. And not only that, I would have concealed this equipment. There's no attempt to hide this thing at all from prying eyes. We're talking about a pretty amateurish setup.
Since stingrays intercept cell phone data, they're equipped to operate in 4G or 5G platforms like most cell phones. But as science writer Mick West points out, the antenna discovered here seemed designed for something else entirely.
This is a long-range antenna, typical of the types of antennas that are used for low-RAW WAN, which is long-range wide area network, which is basically a kind of a digital network commonly used to mine cryptocurrency by providing internet services in areas where there is no coverage.
If the 21st century economy wasn't funky enough for you already, dig this. These internet hotspots are set up to support a new cryptocurrency called Helium. Helium networks use long-range, wide-area networks to support their crypto exchange. People who set up hardware that support and expand that network coverage, like these antennae, are paid in crypto tokens whenever their hotspot is used by the network. The more traffic across your network, the more tokens. And though these Helium miners may not have permission, they do have location.
Just simply by providing this service in this location, which doesn't have any other stations, they get all of the tokens, and so it can be quite lucrative.
Kaku concurs. He says this explains the location of these devices on an isolated trail at elevations over 7,000 feet.
There's big bucks now for people that have tremendous amounts of these antennas in the middle of nowhere where they can receive and send large amounts of information and gamble on the value of cryptocurrency. And so I think that this is consistent with an attempt to make money.
Our verdict? Cryptocurrency mining. We think West's and Kaku's assessment of the homemade nature of these devices fits the bill. But as for how the individuals responsible got these up there, or if they even turned a profit, that will have to go unexplained for now. The use of foot-related evidence in criminal investigations dates back to a murder investigation in 1862. Almost a full century later, the term Bigfoot was first coined in 1958. And from then on, the two fields would be forever intertwined. While there's no murder in our next story, we sure could use a detective. March 2021, Denali National Park and Preserve, Alaska. Park rangers are hiking across the frozen tundra when they come across something they had never seen before. A strange group of footprints sits frozen on the Alaska ice. Adding to the mystery, the four-toed prints appear to be on top of the ice rather than in it. The scale of the large prints is evident in the compacted snow oddly left behind. Many online sleuths believe these prints could be between 16 and 18 inches long, with the spaces between each footprint appearing to average around 3 feet. Field researcher Cliff Barrickman, who runs the North American Bigfoot Center, knows a thing or two about mysterious footprints.
When you look at the footprints in the photographs, they poke above the ground. That's unusual. And could they actually be in a bipedal fashion? And certainly the snow screams Yeti.
There are plenty of stories and evidence to suggest that a Sasquatch-like humanoid could thrive in the frozen tundras like that of Alaska. The indigenous people of the Himalayas coined the term Yeti to describe an ape-like bipedal creature they believed to be stalking the icy cold mountaintops. And the Alaskan natives had their own name for a similar creature they called Nantinuk, which translates to half man, half beast.
One particular story from Alaska, hunters shot a moose and tracked it, and when they got to the area, there was blood everywhere and 18-inch long footprints, but no sign of the moose whatsoever. Whatever left 18-inch footprints brought the moose with it.
But according to Barrickman, there could be another explanation for these prints that many say are downright wolf-like, but huge.
Some people have suggested that these footprints represent that of a dire wolf. These things were big. Their skulls were over 12 inches long and their teeth dwarfed those of modern-day wolves.
The dire wolves were the largest canids during the Pleistocene era, and although extinct, a Montana rancher recently reported encountering one. He was even successful in hunting it, although DNA evidence revealed it was in fact just a large gray wolf.
Could it be that we have some sort of Ice Age remnant here, leaving footprints through Denali National Park?
The dire wolf could weigh up to 200 pounds and grow to up to 6 feet long. And while they are usually associated with the modern-day gray wolf, the dire wolf's DNA actually has more in common with today's African jackals. But is it a wolf or a Bigfoot that left those prints in the snow? Our experts tell us what's afoot. We sat down with biologist Floyd Hayes to make sure that these prints were in fact not left behind by a known species, such as a bear.
The problem with that is that this is in the month of March. These tracks have been there for a while, and at this time of the year, those bears would be asleep. They basically hibernate during the winter months.
Hayes points out that the shape of the prints do not align with that of a typical grizzly.
These footprints look more like a canid, which is a dog of the family Canidae. In bear tracks, you typically see 5 toes, whereas in dogs, you normally see only 4 toes because the 5th toe doesn't quite reach the ground.
If these tracks were made by a member of the Canidae family, how could they appear bipedal? Hayes explains.
When a dog walks, it often places its hind foot in the same position as its front foot, and they often create a single line of tracks that are slightly offset from each other.
So could these be the prints of a long-lost dire wolf? Hayes says that big bad wolf needed a massive, steady supply of fresh meat.
The dire wolf formerly preyed on large species of grazing mammals, but after they became extinct, the dire wolf didn't really have much of a food supply left, and it too became extinct.
But that still doesn't rule out the possibility that these prints could belong to some Sasquatch-like beast, such as the Yeti. Anthropology professor and Bigfoot expert Jeff Meldrum first breaks down how these strange prints could be perfectly preserved, pedestaled atop a giant sheet of ice rather than sunk into it.
When a footprint compresses that snow, it makes it much more resistant both to melting but also to wind erosion. The wind has just scoured away the loose snow, leaving behind the compacted snow beneath the footprint.
This process could possibly make footprints appear like they were left behind by an animal much larger than the actual culprit. But they also preserve some key hidden details.
Primates don't have individual digital pads. You can see the individual digital pads as well as the larger pad of the hind foot of this canid. The pattern is very recognizable, so this is absolutely a gray wolf and not a Sasquatch.
So, our verdict? These weren't made by a Sasquatch or a giant dire wolf, just one of the 10,000 gray or black wolves living in Alaska, with some help from the snowdrift to make its paw prints appear larger. When it comes to most UFO encounters, it's usually just one person who happens to be at the right place at the right time. However, this next incident got a lot of buzz recently because it was seen over 2 days by multiple people. So we've got different perspectives of the same strange phenomenon, but do they lead to the same answer? December 1st, 2022. Fredonia, Wisconsin. It's just before 11 p.m., and after working a long day, Ken B is out for a stroll.
So I was walking outside, and it's very dark. We do not have street lights or anything like that in the area.
Suddenly, something dashes above Ken in the night sky. So he pulls out his cell phone and captures this. A group of 4 lights quickly streak across the sky.
They appeared from behind me, went across the sky. You could see a little flash of light right before they disappeared.
Then 5 more lights, moving a little more slowly, make the same startling motion.
It was kind of a creepy experience. I'd be kidding you if I said it wasn't.
The following evening, Chris Nowak is 40 miles south in Greenfield, Wisconsin, where he records these mysterious lights in the sky.
They would pulse through and race incredibly quickly. It was like this charge of light that would go through from as far back as we could see in literally a second or two. It really seemed to defy logical explanation.
Did Ken and Chris witness the same mysterious phenomenon? Could it be alien? Writer Amy Title says it's not crazy to think so, especially if you know Wisconsin.
You can understand why someone would think this is something otherworldly, because Wisconsin has an incredible amount of UFO sightings going back to the 1950s.
Title notes that one of the most controversial sightings took place in the mid-1960s near Green Bay.
For 4 nights in a row, eyewitnesses observed and filmed UFO activity. But when they reported those incidents to the National Guard, all of their films were confiscated. In the years that followed, the individuals tried to figure out what it was they were seeing, but none of them were ever given straight answers.
Wisconsin has been a UFO hotspot for so long that over 70 years ago, husband and wife Jim and Coral Lorenzen formed a group known as the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization to document UFO cases from all around the state. Do these sightings qualify to make the list? Let's see what our experts say. Have Ken and Chris documented another extraordinary moment in Wisconsin UFO history? Rich Hoffman wants to believe, but in this case, he can't.
There's no instantaneous acceleration that was visible. These were consistently moving at not even hypersonic speeds. The lights were moving across the sky and going in a relatively normal pattern. There's nothing here that looks extraterrestrial.
Time to call in our super sleuth, science writer and video analyst Mick West. And right off the bat, he's sure this isn't any video trickery.
Chris and Ken's sightings are similar in that we see clouds in both videos, and we see lights that move around.
But it's the way the lights change shape as they move through the cloud cover that gives the biggest clue in Ken's video.
If you point a light straight up at something, it's a nice round spot. If it's at an angle, the further away they get, the more stretched out they will get. And as they get closer in, we see they get shorter and shorter.
This indicates the lights are being projected from a fixed point on the ground. But what about the jumpier lights in the Greenfield video?
We've all used a laser pointer and had our cats chase it. I think what we're looking at here looks like lights that are being shone up from below onto the clouds.
So what is the source of these lights? Ken and Chris's videos were filmed at different times and 40 miles apart. West investigates Ken's video first and learns of another eyewitness to his exact same sighting, so he plots the coordinates.
Now, the good thing is we have another witness. We know which road she was on, and we know roughly what direction she was looking in. So we can stick her location on the map, and she was actually in a very different location, way down here towards West Bend. So now we've got 2 lines of sight from 2 different people.
Knowing approximately where the lights came from, West makes a final call.
I contacted the local Chamber of Commerce, and they said the Flanders family have an annual light show, which they do for charity every year, and the location of it is more or less where these 2 lines cross. And they had spotlights mounted on the roof of the house, and it's, in every way, it is a match.
It turns out this alien invasion is just a celebration of holiday cheer.
I think that Ken was looking at the Flanders family Christmas lights, and I think that Chris was looking at a different set of Christmas lights about 40 miles away.
I began this story the same way I began watching The Proof Is Out There, with a quiet skepticism that felt almost ritualistic, as if doubt itself were a protective charm against the seductive pull of mysteries presented with ominous music and carefully edited testimony. And yet from the first minutes the series does something curious, something that as a novelist I find endlessly fascinating, because it does not ask the viewer to believe, it asks the viewer to linger, to sit inside the question, And in this opening part, one imagine myself not merely as a spectator but as a character drifting through the layered corridors of evidence, rumor, science, and fear that define the episode threads like the Falcon 9 anomaly and the so-called demonic wall, both of which function less as isolated cases and more as mirrors reflecting our modern anxiety about technology, the unknown, and the fragile boundary between explanation and wonder. And so the narrative voice I adopt is one of measured obsession, the kind that takes notes late at night, rewinds footage frame by frame, and wonders why certain images refuse to fade even after reason has spoken, because when the Falcon 9 rocket appears to twist and fracture in the sky, leaving behind a visual puzzle that looks almost organic, like a spine bending or a serpent shedding its skin, the show presents experts who calmly discuss stage separation, camera perspective, and atmospheric distortion, yet the image itself carries a symbolic weight that exceeds its explanation, and in my fictionalized retelling I let that image haunt the narrator, not because it defies physics but because it resembles too closely the myths of fallen stars and burning messengers that humanity has told itself for thousands of years. And this is where The Proof Is Out There excels as raw material for fiction, because it understands that proof is not only a matter of data but of interpretation, of cultural memory, of the stories we already carry when we look at the sky. And so the Falcon 9 mystery becomes in my narrative a moment of convergence where the cold language of aerospace engineering collides with an older, almost religious awe, and the narrator recalls childhood nights spent staring upward, convinced that the universe was watching back. And that sense of being observed quietly returns when modern rockets trace impossible shapes above our cities, turning routine launches into shared spectacles that invite both celebration and suspicion. And then the story shifts toward the demonic wall, a phrase that in the show is treated cautiously, almost reluctantly, because it risks sensationalism, yet it persists because the footage itself is unsettling, a massive dark formation appearing to stretch across the horizon like a scar or a barricade. And here I lean into the metaphorical potential, imagining the wall not as a literal demonic structure, but as a psychological construct, a manifestation of collective fear projected onto natural or man-made phenomena. And the narrator interviews geologists, meteorologists, theologians, and conspiracy theorists, each offering a fragment of meaning that fails to fully contain the image, because the wall, whether it is a shadow, a cloud formation, or a digital artifact, triggers something primal, the idea of a boundary beyond which we are not meant to pass. And as a novelist, I allow the narrator to feel that pull, that temptation to believe that some lines are drawn not by nature but by intent, and this tension between rational analysis and imaginative escalation is sustained deliberately, mirroring the structure of the series itself, which never resolves its cases with triumphant certainty but instead leaves room for doubt, and in doing so respects the intelligence of its audience while also acknowledging the emotional dimension of mystery, because fear and curiosity are not errors in thinking. They are evolutionary tools, and when the show dissects viral clips and eyewitness accounts, it is also dissecting the way information moves in the digital age, mutating as it spreads, gaining symbolic power independent of its factual core. And so in this first part of my narrative, the Falcon 9 and the demonic wall are less about what they are and more about what they do to those who witness them, how they destabilize the comfortable assumption that everything extraordinary must have a simple explanation. And I write the narrator as someone who wants explanation desperately but is honest enough to admit that understanding does not always dissolve unease, because even when the experts speak, even when diagrams are drawn and probabilities calculated, there remains an afterimage, a residue of strangeness that clings to the mind, and that residue is where fiction lives, where the story breathes, and where the proof is out there quietly invites us to dwell, not to surrender to irrationality, but to acknowledge that the universe is larger than our current maps of it, and that sometimes the most truthful response to an image of a twisting rocket or a looming wall in the distance is not to declare it solved, but to ask why it mattered to us in the first place, why it spread, why it frightened or thrilled, and why long after the episode ends, we find ourselves looking at the sky or the horizon with a slightly altered gaze, as if expecting the world to reveal another fracture, another sign, another invitation to question the solidity of what we think we know. And this is how I choose to end the first movement of this 12-part novel, not with an answer, but with a heightened state of attention, the sense that reality itself has become a text to be read closely, skeptically, imaginatively, and with humility, because the proof may be out there, but so is our need to interpret it, to weave it into stories that help us navigate an age where every anomaly can become a myth within minutes. And every myth demands, in return, that we decide how much of ourselves we are willing to project into the unknown. In Part 2, the narrative deepens not by expanding outward into new phenomena immediately but by turning inward, examining the machinery of belief itself, because after the Falcon 9 distortion and the demonic wall have unsettled the narrator's sense of visual trust, The Proof Is Out There quietly introduces a more insidious question, one that I as a novelist find even more fertile than flying objects or ominous structures, namely how the modern mind negotiates authority when confronted with competing explanations that all claim legitimacy. And so the narrator begins this section in a studio bathed in neutral light, watching experts debate slowed-down footage frame by frame, each pixel scrutinized until it becomes abstract. And what strikes him is not the clarity produced by this process but the way meaning fractures further, because each specialist sees what their training predisposes them to see. The physicist notices vectors and velocities, the engineer notices stress points and material behavior, the psychologist notices pattern recognition and cognitive bias, and the narrator realizes that proof is not a monolith but a mosaic assembled from perspectives that rarely align perfectly. And this realization becomes the emotional spine of Part 2, as he recalls earlier eras when authority felt singular, when an official explanation could close a mystery with finality, whereas now explanations proliferate like branches, each plausible within its own framework yet insufficient to silence the others. And this is where the series, and my fictional expansion of it, brushes against something almost existential, because the loss of a single authoritative narrative leaves individuals responsible for assembling their own understanding, a task that is both empowering and terrifying. And so the narrator recounts scrolling through comment sections late at night, watching strangers argue not just about what a video shows but about the nature of reality itself, some clinging fiercely to expert consensus as a lifeline, others rejecting it entirely in favor of intuition, revelation, or distrust born from historical deception. And the show's calm analytical tone contrasts sharply with this emotional undercurrent, creating a tension that I exploit deliberately, allowing the narrator to feel sympathy for both sides. Because skepticism toward institutions is not born in a vacuum, and faith in science is not mere obedience but often a hard-won commitment to methods that have delivered real progress. And this ambivalence becomes embodied in a new case introduced midway through the episode. A strange object captured on thermal imaging, its shape ambiguous, its movement irregular, its heat signature defying easy categorization. And as experts debate whether it is a bird, debris, equipment malfunction, or something more exotic, the narrator notices how quickly language shifts from descriptive to symbolic, how phrases like unknown craft or anomalous entity carry emotional weight far beyond their technical meaning. And here I let the narrator imagine the object as a kind of Rorschach test, revealing more about the observer than the observed, because those inclined toward wonder see intention and design, those inclined toward caution see error and coincidence, and neither response is purely irrational, since human cognition evolved to detect agency and pattern as survival mechanisms, and the show's brilliance lies in acknowledging this, without exploiting it, presenting uncertainty not as a failure but as a state to be navigated responsibly. And so Part 2 becomes a meditation on uncertainty itself, on the discomfort it generates and the narratives we build to soothe that discomfort, whether through definitive debunking or through expansive speculation. And the narrator confesses that as a writer he feels the pull of speculation keenly, because stories thrive on unanswered questions. Yet he also recognizes the ethical line between imaginative exploration and manipulative myth-making, especially in an age where viral content can incite fear, paranoia, or false belief at scale. And this ethical tension surfaces when the demonic wall footage reappears in the episode, now contextualized with additional data suggesting natural explanations, but the narrator notes how for many viewers the initial impression has already calcified into belief, illustrating the psychological principle that first narratives often endure, even when contradicted. And this observation leads him to reflect on historical precedents, from medieval portents interpreted as divine wrath to early modern sightings of comets blamed for plagues and wars, drawing a continuous line between past and present that undermines the comforting notion that we are uniquely rational now, because technology has changed but the human mind has not evolved at the same pace, still yearning for meaning, still uneasy with randomness, still tempted to personalize the impersonal forces of nature and physics. And yet the narrator does not adopt a tone of superiority. Instead he includes himself among the susceptible, recalling moments when even he felt a chill watching a shadow move unnaturally or a light behave unexpectedly, moments when explanation lagged behind perception and imagination rushed in to fill the gap, and this honesty grounds the narrative, aligning it with the show's refusal to mock or dismiss witnesses outright, treating their experiences as data points shaped by context rather than as evidence of gullibility. And as part 2 progresses, the narrator begins to see the proof is out there as less a catalog of mysteries and more a case study in epistemology for the mass audience, teaching viewers not what to think but how to think about the unknown, modeling a process that balances open-mindedness with methodological rigor. And this balance becomes symbolized in a recurring image of a scale, one side weighted with curiosity, the other with caution, and the narrator muses that modern discourse often tips too far in one direction or the other, either dismissing anomalies reflexively or embracing them uncritically, whereas the show occupies the uncomfortable middle ground, where answers are provisional and confidence is tempered. And in my fictional expansion, this middle ground becomes a physical space, a metaphorical archive where unresolved cases are stored not as failures, but as invitations for future inquiry, and the narrator imagines himself wandering this archive, shelves lined with footage, reports, and testimonies, each labeled not solved or debunked but pending understanding. And this image resonates deeply because it reframes mystery not as a threat but as a natural feature of an evolving knowledge system. And as part 2 draws toward its conclusion, the narrator returns once more to the Falcon 9 footage, now armed with more technical context yet still struck by its aesthetic power, acknowledging that beauty and explanation are not mutually exclusive, that a phenomenon can be fully explained and still inspire awe, and this realization softens the earlier tension between science and wonder, suggesting a synthesis rather than a conflict, because to understand how something happens does not diminish its capacity to move us, and perhaps the true danger lies not in mystery itself but in the refusal to engage with it thoughtfully. And so the second part ends with the narrator standing at this intersection of knowledge and imagination, resolved not to choose one at the expense of the other, but to continue walking the narrow path between, aware that certainty is rare, humility is essential, and the unknown is not an enemy to be conquered but a companion that challenges us to refine both our questions and our stories, especially in a world where every anomaly can become a symbol, and every symbol can shape belief faster than truth can catch up. Part 3 opens with a subtle shift in tone, because after the internal debates about belief, authority, and uncertainty explored earlier, the narrative now turns toward the lived experience of witnesses, those ordinary individuals whose fleeting encounters with anomalies become the raw fuel for the proof is out there. And as a novelist, I find these moments crucial, since they ground abstract discussions in human memory, emotion, and vulnerability. And so the narrator begins by revisiting a recurring theme in the series, the testimony of people who did not seek mystery but stumbled into it during routines as mundane as driving home, checking a security camera, or glancing at the sky while taking out the trash. And this emphasis reframes anomalies not as spectacles reserved for researchers or thrill seekers but as intrusions into everyday life, which is precisely why they resonate so deeply, because they disrupt the quiet assumption that the world behaves predictably when we are not paying attention. And the narrator reflects on how the show treats these witnesses with a deliberate gentleness, avoiding ridicule while also avoiding unquestioning endorsement, creating a narrative space where personal truth and empirical scrutiny coexist uneasily. And this coexistence becomes the emotional core of Part 3, as the narrator imagines sitting across from one such witness, a middle-aged man whose voice trembles not from excitement but from lingering confusion, recounting how a dark shape rose silently behind a tree line, paused, and then vanished, leaving behind no physical trace but an enduring sense of disorientation. And the narrator notes that what unsettles the man most is not the possibility that he saw something extraordinary but the possibility that he cannot trust his own perception, a fear that cuts deeper than belief or disbelief, because it threatens the foundation of self-reliability. And this fear echoes throughout the episode, as multiple cases reveal similar emotional aftershocks, sleepless nights, compulsive rewatching of footage, strained conversations with friends who either dismiss or sensationalize the experience. And the show's analytical framework intersects here with something more intimate, almost therapeutic, acknowledging that explaining a phenomenon does not automatically heal the psychological rupture it causes. And as the narrator observes this, he begins to question the implicit hierarchy that places objective explanation above subjective experience, wondering whether a complete understanding of anomalies must account not only for what happened but for how it altered the inner landscape of those who witnessed it. And this question leads him back to the Falcon 9 case once more, now viewed through the eyes of onlookers who had no interest in aerospace engineering yet felt a jolt of existential unease watching a familiar symbol of technological mastery appear to behave unpredictably, and the narrator imagines one such onlooker, a teenager who grew up associating rockets with progress and optimism, suddenly confronted with an image that felt wrong, not because it was inexplicable, but because it violated an emotional expectation of order, and this violation becomes emblematic of a broader cultural moment, in which institutions once perceived as stable now appear fragile or opaque, feeding a climate where anomalies are interpreted not merely as curiosities, but as signs of systemic uncertainty. And the proof is out there navigates this terrain carefully, offering explanations without dismissing the emotional context that makes those explanations harder to accept. And in my fictional expansion, I allow the narrator to draw parallels with earlier historical moments of technological disruption, recalling how the first railways inspired both awe and terror, how early aviation sparked rumors of unnatural forces at work, how each leap forward carried with it a shadow of fear that the new tools might exceed human control, and this historical lens tempers the tendency to view contemporary anxieties as uniquely irrational, instead situating them within a recurring pattern of adaptation, where imagination races ahead of comprehension, and Part 3 deepens further by introducing the idea of narrative contamination, the process by which a single unexplained clip becomes intertwined with other stories, symbols, and myths circulating online, until its original context dissolves into a web of associations, and the narrator describes watching the demonic wall footage resurface in altered forms, edited, slowed, color-corrected, overlaid with ominous music, each iteration drifting further from the source while gaining emotional potency. And this phenomenon troubles him not because it spreads falsehoods alone but because it demonstrates how easily meaning can be reshaped to serve different agendas, from monetized fear to ideological reinforcement. And the show's insistence on returning to original data, raw footage, and primary testimony emerges here as an act of resistance against this drift. A reminder that interpretation must remain anchored even as it remains open. And yet the narrator admits that even raw data is not immune to interpretation, because context, framing, and expectation influence perception at every stage, and this admission leads him to confront his own role as a storyteller, recognizing that by weaving these cases into a novelistic narrative he too participates in shaping meaning, selecting emphasis, tone, and metaphor, and this self-awareness becomes a quiet ethical checkpoint within the text, reinforcing the responsibility that accompanies the act of retelling mysteries, especially those that touch on fear, belief, and the unknown. And as Part 3 unfolds, the narrator recounts a moment from the series where an expert pauses mid-explanation, acknowledging a margin of error, a gap where data ends and inference begins, and this pause strikes the narrator as profoundly honest, even courageous, because it resists the pressure to perform certainty for an audience hungry for closure. And he contrasts this with a culture of absolute claims that dominates much online discourse, where ambiguity is treated as weakness and doubt as betrayal, and the narrator finds in The Proof Is Out There a counter-narrative that validates uncertainty as an integral part of knowledge, rather than a failure of it. And this validation extends to witnesses whose experiences are not invalidated by the absence of definitive proof, but contextualized within broader patterns of perception and misperception, allowing empathy without capitulation. And this balance inspires the narrator to reflect on his own formative encounter with the unknown, a childhood memory of lights moving erratically above a rural road, later explained as aircraft but never fully stripped of their emotional charge. And he realizes that explanation and memory coexist, rather than overwrite each other, each occupying a different register of experience, and this realization softens his earlier anxiety about perception, suggesting that to be human is to live with layered understandings, some rational, some emotional, some symbolic, all contributing to a composite sense of reality. And as Part 3 approaches its conclusion, the narrator envisions the series as a kind of modern campfire, where stories of the strange are told not to frighten but to explore, with experts playing the role of elders who contextualize without extinguishing curiosity, and viewers gathering not for answers alone but for shared contemplation. And this image resonates strongly because it reframes the act of watching not as passive consumption but as communal inquiry, a collective attempt to map the edges of understanding without pretending those edges do not exist. And so the third part ends on a note of cautious empathy, recognizing that behind every clip analyzed and every Anomaly debated there is a human story of surprise, fear, wonder, or confusion, and that any meaningful engagement with the unknown must honor these stories even as it subjects their claims to scrutiny, because truth pursued without empathy becomes brittle, and empathy without rigor becomes illusion, and the proof is out there, at its best, occupies the fragile space where both are required, inviting us not to choose between belief and skepticism but to practice them together, patiently, responsibly, and with an awareness of our own cognitive limits, as we continue to navigate a world where the extraordinary often appears without warning, demanding not only explanation but understanding in the fullest sense of the word. Part 4 marks a transition from the intimate psychology of witnesses to the broader architecture of investigation itself, because after listening to individual voices and tracing how perception, memory, and emotion shape encounters with the unexplained, the narrative now steps behind the curtain to examine the systems that claim to arbitrate truth. And in The Proof Is Out There, this means laboratories, studios, databases, and panels of specialists who operate at the intersection of science and media. And as a novelist, I am drawn to this intersection because it is where knowledge becomes performance without necessarily becoming fiction, where authority must be communicated as much as it is exercised. And so the narrator begins this section observing the ritualized calm of expert analysis, the measured tone, the careful choice of words, the avoidance of sensational phrasing even when the subject matter flirts with the sensational by nature. And he contrasts this with the internal pressure he imagines these experts feel, knowing that any definitive statement will be scrutinized, clipped, shared, and potentially weaponized by audiences eager either to affirm or to reject it. And this awareness infuses their caution with a moral dimension, because to explain too much too confidently risks misleading, while to hedge excessively risks feeding suspicion. And the narrator senses that this balancing act is one of the unspoken dramas of the series, unfolding quietly beneath the explicit discussion of anomalies, and he begins to frame the show as a case study in epistemic responsibility, an exploration of how knowledge should be communicated in an age of fragmented trust, where expertise is simultaneously demanded and doubted. And this theme crystallizes around a new segment involving radar data that appears to show objects moving at impossible speeds, and as specialists dissect the data, discussing signal reflection, atmospheric interference, and equipment limitations, the narrator notes how invisible most of this labor remains to the casual viewer, who sees only the conclusion without fully grasping the fragile chain of assumptions that supports it. And this invisibility troubles him, because it creates fertile ground for misinterpretation, allowing critics to claim that explanations are arbitrary or self-serving. And yet the narrator also recognizes that no explanation can ever be fully transparent to a non-specialist audience, that some degree of trust is unavoidable. And this realization leads him to reflect on trust not as blind faith, but as a provisional contract, renewed through consistency, humility, and openness to revision, qualities that The Proof Is Out There attempts to model even when it risks appearing inconclusive. And as Part 4 unfolds, the narrator introduces a metaphor that becomes central to this section, that of scaffolding, describing scientific explanations as temporary structures erected to access understanding, useful but not permanent, always subject to adjustment or removal as new data emerges. And he contrasts this with the public expectation of finality, the desire for explanations that function as monuments rather than scaffolds, solid and unchanging. And he suggests that much of the tension surrounding anomalous phenomena arises from this mismatch of expectations, where audiences crave certainty but science offers probability, margins of error, and evolving models. And this tension is dramatized in the series when an initial debunking is later refined or partially revised, not overturned but nuanced. And the narrator observes how even minor revisions can be perceived as weakness or deception by those unfamiliar with the iterative nature of scientific inquiry. And he imagines a viewer interpreting revision as evidence of conspiracy rather than of rigor, a misinterpretation that feels tragic because it reverses the very logic of critical thinking. And this leads the narrator to consider the cultural narratives that frame science either as infallible or corrupt, leaving little room for a more realistic portrayal of it as a human endeavor constrained by tools, time, and incomplete information. And The Proof Is Out There, in its restrained way, attempts to carve out this middle narrative, portraying experts as neither omniscient nor duplicitous, but as professionals navigating uncertainty with discipline. And this portrayal resonates deeply with the narrator, who as a writer, recognizes the parallel between scientific explanation and storytelling, both requiring selection, framing, and an awareness of audience reception. And this self-recognition adds another layer of reflexivity to the text, as he acknowledges that his own narrative choices shape how readers will perceive these mysteries, even as he strives for balance. And Part 4 deepens further by examining the role of technology, not only as a source of anomalies, but as a mediator of investigation, because cameras, sensors, and algorithms both reveal and distort reality, extending perception while introducing new forms of error. And the narrator reflects on how high-resolution footage paradoxically increases ambiguity, allowing viewers to zoom into artifacts, compression errors, and noise patterns that invite overinterpretation. And this paradox fascinates him, because it suggests that clarity does not always reduce mystery, but can multiply it, offering more data points without necessarily providing more meaning. And The Proof Is Out There grapples with this paradox by contextualizing images within their technical limitations, reminding viewers that seeing more does not mean understanding more, a lesson that feels increasingly urgent in a culture obsessed with visual evidence. And this urgency becomes personal for the narrator when he recalls his own impulse to trust images over testimony, to believe that cameras cannot lie, only to learn that they lie constantly through framing, distortion, and selective capture. And this realization undermines simplistic hierarchies of evidence, encouraging a more nuanced approach that weighs different forms of information without absolutism. And as Part 4 progresses, the demonic wall returns yet again, now dissected through geological surveys and atmospheric models. And while the explanations offered are compelling, the narrator notes how the phrase itself, demonic wall, continues to exert symbolic power, illustrating how language shapes perception long before analysis begins. And he reflects on the ethical responsibility of naming, recognizing that labels can prime fear or curiosity, skepticism or belief. And he appreciates the show's effort to de-escalate language even as it addresses sensational claims, understanding that words are not neutral vessels but active participants in meaning-making. And this sensitivity to language mirrors his own concerns as a novelist, reinforcing the parallel between investigative and narrative ethics. And as the section nears its conclusion, the narrator turns outward, considering the audience as a collective participant in the investigative process, whose reactions, comments, and interpretations feed back into the life cycle of anomalies, influencing which cases gain traction and which fade. And he suggests that The Proof Is Out There implicitly invites viewers to adopt a more disciplined form of curiosity, one that resists immediate conclusions and values process over spectacle. And this invitation, he argues, is quietly radical in a media environment optimized for outrage and immediacy. And so Part 4 ends with the narrator standing in an imagined control room, screens flickering with data, footage, and commentary, aware that truth emerges not from any single screen but from the dialogue between them, mediated by patience, humility, and a willingness to accept provisional answers. And this awareness becomes a kind of intellectual stance, a commitment to inquiry that does not promise certainty but offers something more sustainable, a method for living with mystery without surrendering to fear or cynicism. And in this sense, the anomalies themselves recede slightly, making room for a deeper focus on how we know what we know, and how we might do so more responsibly in a world where the unknown is amplified by technology and shaped by narrative at every turn. Part 5 shifts the center of gravity once again, moving from the structured environments of experts and investigative systems into the unruly ecosystem of the public sphere. Because once anomalies leave the studio and enter the open world of social platforms, forums, and late-night conversations, they take on lives of their own. And The Proof Is Out There treats this transformation not as a side effect but as a central phenomenon worthy of examination. And as a novelist, I seize upon this because it reveals how mystery in the modern era is no longer confined to the event itself but expands through circulation, repetition, and reinterpretation. And so the narrator begins this section immersed in the endless scroll of reactions, watching how a single clip of the Falcon 9 distortion fractures into countless narratives depending on who shares it and why, some framing it as evidence of hidden technology, others as proof of deception, others still as a harmless optical illusion exaggerated for clicks, and what fascinates him is not merely the diversity of interpretations but the speed with which they solidify into identity markers, signals of belonging to a particular worldview, because belief or disbelief becomes a badge, a shorthand for deeper attitudes toward authority, progress, and risk, and the narrator realizes that in this environment anomalies function less as questions to be answered and more as symbols to be claimed, and this realization casts the series in a new light, positioning it as a rare attempt to slow down a process that thrives on acceleration, insisting on pause, context, and method in a culture that rewards immediacy and emotional impact. And Part 5 explores the cost of that acceleration through imagined portraits of viewers whose engagement with anomalies becomes obsessive, not because they are irrational but because the content speaks to unmet needs, a desire for meaning, agency, or community, and the narrator describes one such figure, a retired technician who spends hours dissecting frames, drawing lines, annotating motion paths, driven not by paranoia but by a longing to contribute, to feel that his analytical skills still matter in a world that has moved on without him, and this portrait complicates simplistic dismissals of online speculation, revealing the human motivations that underlie it, and the show's respectful tone toward amateur analysis, even as it corrects errors, reflects an awareness of these motivations, an understanding that ridicule hardens belief while engagement can soften it, and this approach resonates deeply with the narrator, who recalls how often public discourse collapses into contempt, erasing nuance and reinforcing division, and he begins to see the proof is out there as practicing a form of intellectual hospitality, inviting curiosity while setting boundaries, welcoming questions without endorsing every conclusion, and this hospitality becomes especially significant when the demonic wall resurfaces in online spaces stripped of its contextual explanations, repackaged as proof of metaphysical danger, and the narrator watches how fear spreads not through argument but through imagery and repetition, the same clip replayed with different captions, each escalating the implied threat, and he reflects on how fear is contagious not because people are foolish but because fear once kept our ancestors alive, priming attention toward potential danger, and modern media exploits this ancient circuitry, often unintentionally, creating feedback loops that amplify anxiety, and the proof is out there counters this by reintroducing proportionality, situating anomalies within statistical and environmental baselines that reframe them as rare but not unprecedented, unusual but not necessarily ominous, and Part 5 examines how difficult this reframing can be once an image has taken root emotionally, because emotion precedes analysis and often resists correction, and the narrator admits that even he feels the pull of those initial impressions, the visceral reaction that lingers despite rational understanding, and this admission leads him to explore the concept of emotional truth, not as an alternative to factual truth but as a parallel layer that must be acknowledged, because dismissing emotional responses outright only drives them underground, where they can resurface in more distorted forms, and the series, by validating curiosity without validating every fear, models a healthier engagement with emotional truth, and this modeling becomes especially relevant when Part 5 introduces a segment on historical misinterpretations, cases where phenomena once deemed supernatural were later understood through advances in science, and the narrator reflects on how these examples are often wielded triumphantly, as proof that all mysteries will eventually yield to explanation, but he cautions against this triumphalism, noting that such narratives can breed complacency, the assumption that uncertainty is merely temporary noise rather than a permanent feature of existence, and he suggests that the proof is out there avoids this trap by emphasizing process over endpoint, reminding viewers that understanding is iterative and incomplete by nature, and this humility stands in contrast to both apocalyptic speculation and dismissive rationalism, offering a third posture that embraces curiosity without catastrophizing. And Part 5 deepens its exploration of community by examining how shared mystery can bond people across differences, as online discussions reveal moments of genuine collaboration, where skeptics and believers exchange data, challenge assumptions, and occasionally revise their views, and the narrator lingers on these moments as fragile but hopeful signs that discourse need not devolve into polarization, and he credits the show with fostering this possibility by modeling respectful disagreement, demonstrating that one can challenge claims without attacking character, a lesson that feels increasingly rare and increasingly necessary, and as the narrative unfolds, the narrator introduces a personal anecdote about attending a public lecture inspired by the series, where audience members ask questions that range from technical to philosophical, revealing a hunger not just for answers but for frameworks to think with. And this hunger underscores the cultural role of shows like The Proof is Out There, which function not merely as entertainment but as informal education, shaping how audiences approach uncertainty in other domains, from science to politics to personal decision-making, and the narrator reflects on how this influence carries responsibility, because framing matters, tone matters, and the choice to emphasize skepticism without cynicism can ripple outward into broader patterns of thought. And Part 5 examines the potential consequences of neglecting this responsibility, imagining alternate media ecosystems, where anomalies are treated purely as clickbait, stripped of nuance, fueling cycles of fear and distrust, and he contrasts this dystopian vision with the quieter, slower approach of the series, which may not dominate algorithms but offers a counterweight to them, and this contrast sharpens the narrator's appreciation for restraint as a narrative virtue, the courage to be less dramatic in a culture that equates drama with relevance. And as the section approaches its conclusion, the narrator returns to the image of the demonic wall one final time in this part, not to reanalyze it technically but to reflect on its symbolic evolution, how it has shifted from a specific visual anomaly to a floating signifier invoked in unrelated debates as shorthand for hidden danger, and this evolution becomes emblematic of how mysteries escape their origins, becoming cultural artifacts shaped by collective imagination. And the narrator suggests that understanding this process is as important as understanding the phenomena themselves, because it reveals how societies construct meaning under conditions of uncertainty. And so Part 5 ends with the narrator stepping back from individual cases to view the broader landscape, a complex terrain where evidence, emotion, identity, and technology intersect, and he recognizes that navigating this terrain requires more than facts alone. It requires narrative literacy, the ability to recognize framing, to tolerate ambiguity, and to engage curiosity, without surrendering to fear. And in this sense, The Proof is Out There emerges not just as a series about anomalies but as a quiet training ground for modern citizenship in an age of information overload, offering tools not to eliminate mystery but to live with it more thoughtfully, more responsibly, and with a greater awareness of the human impulses that shape how mystery is received, shared, and transformed. Part 6 pivots toward time itself as a silent protagonist, because after tracing how anomalies circulate through public space and collective emotion, the narrative now asks what happens when mystery endures, when days turn into months and explanations either settle into consensus or dissolve into the background noise of newer questions. And The Proof is Out There implicitly acknowledges that not all mysteries demand immediate resolution. Some simply linger, reshaping perception gradually rather than erupting dramatically. And as a novelist, I find this temporal dimension essential, since time tests belief more ruthlessly than debate ever could, eroding sensational claims while also deepening unresolved unease. And so the narrator begins this section by revisiting earlier cases after the media cycle has moved on, imagining what remains once attention fades, and he discovers that what persists is rarely the technical detail but the emotional imprint, the subtle shift in how witnesses and viewers orient themselves toward the world, a slight hesitation before dismissing an odd sight, a lingering curiosity that resists closure. And this persistence becomes the thematic core of Part 6, as the narrator reflects on how The Proof is Out There functions not as a conveyor belt of answers but as a chronicle of encounters with uncertainty that continue to echo beyond the episode's runtime. And he recalls interviews where experts admit that while a case may be explained to a reasonable degree, absolute certainty remains elusive, not because of conspiracy but because data is finite and conditions are imperfect. And this admission reframes uncertainty as a permanent companion rather than a temporary obstacle, and the narrator begins to explore how different individuals respond to this companionship, some finding it invigorating, others intolerable, and this divergence leads him to a deeper meditation on personality, temperament, and cultural conditioning, recognizing that tolerance for ambiguity varies widely and shapes how people engage with anomalous claims, and the show's refusal to cater exclusively to either extreme, neither promising definitive revelation nor dismissing curiosity, positions it as a mediator between these dispositions, offering a shared space where different comfort levels with uncertainty can coexist. And Part 6 dramatizes this mediation through a case involving delayed clarification, where an initially puzzling phenomenon captured on long-range sensors remains unexplained for an extended period before additional data gradually narrows the possibilities. And the narrator traces this process with deliberate slowness, emphasizing the intervals of not knowing, the speculative gaps filled by commentary, imagination, and sometimes anxiety, and he contrasts this with the eventual arrival of a plausible explanation, noting how anticlimactic it can feel, not because it lacks rigor but because it arrives after emotional investment has already peaked, and this anticlimax reveals something profound about human engagement with mystery, that the journey often matters more than the destination, and that resolution can feel strangely hollow when anticipation has done its work. And this realization leads the narrator to reconsider the value of unresolved cases within the series, suggesting that their power lies not in frustration but in humility, reminding viewers that the world does not owe us tidy endings, and that knowledge advances unevenly, often leaving loose threads behind, and this perspective challenges a deeply ingrained narrative expectation shaped by fiction itself, where mysteries are constructed to be solved, and as a novelist the narrator feels the irony keenly, recognizing that while he is crafting a long-form narrative inspired by the series itself resists narrative closure, offering instead a mosaic of provisional understandings, and this tension between narrative desire and epistemic reality becomes a reflective loop within Part 6, as the narrator questions his own impulse to impose coherence where none may fully exist, and he decides to let the structure breathe, allowing gaps and uncertainties to remain visible rather than smoothing them over, and this decision mirrors the show's ethos, reinforcing the parallel between responsible investigation and responsible storytelling, and the section deepens by examining how memory transforms anomalies over time, as witnesses recall events with subtle alterations, not out of deceit but because memory is reconstructive, influenced by subsequent information, discussion, and reflection, and the narrator draws on cognitive research presented indirectly through expert commentary, noting how recollection is shaped by narrative frameworks that provide meaning, and he imagines a witness revisiting their sighting years later, now filtered through countless retellings, articles, and debates, until the original perception is inseparable from its interpretations, and this process complicates any attempt to retrieve a pure account, underscoring the importance of contemporaneous documentation while also acknowledging its limitations, and The Proof Is Out There addresses this by prioritizing original footage and immediate testimony, yet even these are products of context, framing, and expectation, and the narrator accepts this not as a flaw but as a reality to be navigated thoughtfully, and Part 6 explores the emotional consequences of long-term uncertainty, describing how some witnesses find peace in explanation while others feel a sense of loss, as if an unexplained event had given their life a brief touch of transcendence that explanation now dulls, and this ambivalence challenges simplistic assumptions about the psychological benefits of debunking, revealing that closure is not universally desired, and the narrator reflects on how this complicates the ethical calculus of investigation. Because, while truth remains paramount, sensitivity to emotional impact matters as well, and the show's gentle tone acknowledges this complexity, offering explanations without triumphalism, and this restraint becomes especially poignant when revisiting the Falcon 9 case, now long after its initial circulation, where the technical explanation has settled into consensus among experts, yet the image still circulates occasionally, stripped of context, reigniting wonder or suspicion among new audiences, and the narrator observes how time does not eliminate anomalies but redistributes them, allowing them to resurface in new contexts with renewed potency, and this cyclical nature of mystery aligns with broader patterns in culture, where unresolved questions recur across generations, each time reframed by contemporary concerns, and Part 6 situates The Proof Is Out There within this long arc, suggesting that the series is less about closing chapters than about contributing annotations to an ongoing human dialogue with the unknown, and this perspective elevates the show from episodic entertainment to a kind of cultural archive, preserving not only cases but modes of inquiry, and the narrator imagines future viewers encountering these episodes as historical artifacts, glimpses into how early 21st century society grappled with uncertainty amid rapid technological change, and this imagined future gaze prompts reflection on our present assumptions, revealing how provisional even our current frameworks are, and Part 6 leans into this humility, encouraging readers and viewers alike to see their own convictions as temporally situated rather than absolute, and this humility becomes a quiet antidote to dogmatism, whether skeptical or credulous, and the narrator reinforces this by recounting moments in the series where experts revise their assessments in light of new evidence, modeling intellectual flexibility rather than defensiveness, and he contrasts this with public discourse that often punishes revision as inconsistency, noting how such punishment discourages honesty and fuels polarization, and the proof is out there, by normalizing revision, implicitly advocates for a healthier epistemic culture, one where changing one's mind is a sign of engagement rather than weakness, and this advocacy resonates with the narrator's own evolution across the narrative, as his stance toward mystery becomes less anxious and more patient, less driven by the need to resolve, and more oriented toward understanding processes, and Part 6 captures this maturation through quieter scenes, moments of reflection rather than revelation, where the narrator watches the night sky not in search of anomalies but with an awareness of scale, recognizing that the vastness of what is known and unknown alike dwarfs individual cases, and this awareness brings a sense of calm rather than dread, reframing uncertainty as a natural condition rather than a threat, and the demonic wall, once charged with ominous symbolism, now appears in his memory as an example of how perception and context can amplify fear, a lesson absorbed rather than dismissed, and as the section approaches its end, the narrator articulates a philosophy that has been forming implicitly, that the value of engaging with the unexplained lies not in confirming extraordinary claims or debunking them decisively, but in cultivating habits of attention, skepticism, empathy, and patience that extend beyond any single case, and the proof is out there serves as a training ground for these habits, offering repeated practice in withholding judgment, weighing evidence, and acknowledging limits, and this practice, he suggests, is transferable, applicable to any domain where information is incomplete and stakes are high. And so Part 6 concludes not with a dramatic anomaly but with a quiet recalibration of perspective, an acceptance that some questions will remain open not because we have failed but because openness itself is a necessary stance in a complex world, and this acceptance does not diminish curiosity but refines it, aligning it with responsibility rather than urgency, and the narrator senses that this refinement marks a turning point in the larger narrative, preparing the ground for deeper explorations of meaning, consequence, and coexistence with the unknown in the parts yet to come. Part 7 advances the narrative by confronting a question that has hovered implicitly over every anomaly discussed so far, namely what these mysteries do to our sense of human centrality, because beneath debates about rockets, walls, radar blips, and strange silhouettes lies a quieter destabilization, the realization that our technologies, perceptions, and explanatory systems may not grant us the mastery we often assume. And the proof is out there gestures toward this destabilization without dramatizing it overtly, allowing it to emerge gradually through accumulation. And as a novelist, I choose to bring this undercurrent to the surface, framing Part 7 as an exploration of humility on a civilizational scale. And so the narrator begins by reflecting on how modern society narrates itself as hyper-informed, data-rich, and increasingly precise, yet remains persistently vulnerable to surprise, not only from the cosmos or nature, but from the unintended consequences of its own creations. And this vulnerability becomes evident when advanced sensors generate more anomalies than they resolve, when improved resolution produces ambiguity rather than clarity, and the narrator recognizes this as a paradox of progress that the proof is out there captures with unusual restraint, never declaring it explicitly yet revealing it through pattern. And Part 7 dwells on this pattern by revisiting cases where technology both reveals and confounds, such as satellite imagery that uncovers unexpected formations or tracking systems that register movements defying intuitive expectations, and the narrator observes how experts respond not with alarm, but with recalibration, adjusting models, questioning assumptions, and acknowledging that tools shape what they detect. And this response contrasts sharply with popular narratives that frame technological surprise as evidence of hidden forces or hostile intent, and the narrator considers why such narratives gain traction, suggesting that they restore a sense of drama and agency to a world increasingly governed by abstract systems, because mystery becomes more tolerable when personified, even if that personification is imagined, and this insight leads him to a deeper reflection on anthropocentrism, the tendency to interpret anomalies in terms of intention, message, or threat directed specifically at humans, and he notes how often unexplained phenomena are framed as warnings, tests, or intrusions, rather than as indifferent processes unfolding without regard for human meaning. And the proof is out there quietly challenges this framing by repeatedly situating anomalies within larger physical systems, atmospheric dynamics, orbital mechanics, sensor limitations, reminding viewers that most phenomena are not about us at all. And this decentering can feel unsettling, even humiliating, because it undermines the comforting belief that humanity occupies a privileged interpretive position in the universe. And Part 7 leans into this discomfort deliberately, allowing the narrator to grapple with the emotional implications of insignificance, not as nihilism but as a corrective to exaggerated self-importance. And he recalls moments in the series where experts speak with awe rather than authority, acknowledging the scale and complexity of the systems they study, and these moments resonate with him more deeply than confident declarations, because they model a posture of respect toward reality, rather than dominance over it. And this posture becomes central to the narrator's evolving philosophy, as he begins to see humility not as a concession, but as a form of strength, a readiness to revise, to listen, to accept that some questions may not be answerable within existing frameworks. And this acceptance does not negate curiosity but anchors it, preventing it from drifting into paranoia or grandiosity. And Part 7 extends this theme by examining how humility functions socially, shaping interactions between experts and the public, skeptics and believers, because when humility is absent, discourse hardens into competing certainties, each side accusing the other of blindness or bad faith, whereas humility opens space for dialogue, acknowledging that no perspective is complete. And the proof is out there, through its tone and structure, implicitly cultivates this space, even when it risks appearing indecisive. And the narrator defends this risk, arguing that decisiveness without adequacy is far more dangerous than caution, especially in matters that touch on fear, belief, and existential meaning. And he illustrates this by imagining alternative versions of the show that prioritize spectacle over process, certainty over nuance. And he notes how easily such versions could inflame anxiety, reinforce distrust, or entrench false beliefs. And this counterfactual exercise sharpens his appreciation for the series' restraint, positioning it as an ethical choice rather than a stylistic one. And Part 7 deepens further by connecting humility to scale, as the narrator reflects on how anomalies often appear dramatic when viewed in isolation, but diminish in significance when contextualized within vast datasets and temporal spans. And this scaling effect mirrors astronomical perspective, where Earth itself becomes a small point within a larger system. And he draws a parallel between looking at the night sky and examining anomalous data, both requiring a willingness to hold multiple scales simultaneously, resisting the impulse to inflate local irregularities into universal significance. And this resistance, he suggests, is cognitively demanding, running counter to storytelling instincts that privilege singular events and dramatic causality. And yet cultivating this resistance is essential for responsible interpretation. And the proof is out there, by repeatedly zooming out after zooming in, models this oscillation of scale, teaching viewers to contextualize without dismissing. And the narrator internalizes this lesson, recognizing its applicability beyond anomalies, to politics, health, and personal decision-making, where isolated data points can mislead when stripped of context. And Part 7 thus expands the scope of the narrative, positioning the series as a training ground for scale literacy, the ability to move between detail and overview without losing coherence. And this literacy becomes especially relevant when the demonic wall is reframed once more, not as a singular ominous structure, but as one instance within a broader class of visual phenomena shaped by light, shadow, terrain, and perspective. And the narrator notes how this reframing diminishes fear without trivializing the experience of those who were unsettled by it, offering understanding without condescension. And this balance reinforces the theme of humility, acknowledging emotional responses while gently situating them within larger patterns. And as Part 7 approaches its conclusion, the narrator turns inward, assessing how his own sense of significance has shifted over the course of the narrative, noticing a quiet relief in relinquishing the burden of cosmic centrality, finding comfort in the idea that not every anomaly is a message, not every mystery a challenge to human supremacy. And this relief allows curiosity to become playful rather than defensive, exploratory rather than anxious. And he senses that this shift marks another stage in his engagement with the unknown, moving from vigilance to attentiveness, from suspicion to curiosity tempered by context. And this maturation aligns with the series' cumulative effect, which does not deliver a single revelation but fosters an attitude over time. And Part 7 captures this attitudinal change as its primary development, presenting humility not as resignation but as an orientation that enables deeper understanding. And so the section ends with the narrator gazing not at a specific anomaly, but at a mosaic of cases, patterns, and responses, recognizing that their collective lesson lies less in what they reveal about hidden forces and more in what they reveal about our interpretive habits, our need for meaning, and our capacity to adjust those needs in light of evidence and perspective. And he concludes that embracing humility does not diminish humanity, but situates it more honestly within a complex universe, allowing us to ask better questions, tell more responsible stories, and coexist with uncertainty, without inflating it into fear or myth. A stance that prepares the ground for the ethical and philosophical implications that will unfold in the next part of the narrative. Part 8 turns decisively toward ethics, not in an abstract moralizing sense but in the lived consequences of how mysteries are framed, shared, and consumed, because after humility and scale have recalibrated the narrator's relationship with the unknown, a more urgent question emerges, namely what responsibilities accompany the act of presenting anomalies to a mass audience. And the proof is out there becomes, in this section, a quiet meditation on ethical storytelling in an age where attention itself is a powerful currency, and the narrator begins by acknowledging that every unexplained clip carries potential consequences beyond curiosity, shaping fear, belief, behavior, and even policy, and this awareness transforms anomalies from neutral curiosities into ethical objects, demanding care in their handling, and the narrator reflects on how easily fear can be monetized, how quickly ambiguous images can be weaponized to erode trust or inflame suspicion, and he contrasts this with the show's measured pacing, which resists the temptation to escalate tension artificially, choosing instead to contextualize, to slow down, to let uncertainty exist without being framed as imminent threat. And this restraint, he argues, is itself an ethical stance, one that prioritizes public well-being over engagement metrics, and Part 8 explores this stance through imagined editorial discussions, where producers debate how much emphasis to place on dramatic language, how to balance intrigue with caution, how to respect witnesses without amplifying unfounded conclusions, and the narrator imagines these conversations not as battles between truth and entertainment, but as negotiations between competing goods, curiosity, clarity, empathy, and responsibility, and this framing avoids simplistic villain narratives, recognizing that media creators operate within systems that reward spectacle, even as they strive for integrity, and the narrator's sympathy extends to these creators, seeing in their choices a microcosm of broader societal dilemmas about information sharing, and Part 8 deepens its ethical inquiry by examining the impact of anomalies on vulnerable audiences, those predisposed to anxiety or distrust, and the narrator considers how repeated exposure to ominously framed mysteries can cultivate a worldview of hidden danger, subtly shifting perception from curiosity to vigilance, and the proof is out there. By repeatedly emphasizing proportionality and context, counters this drift, offering reassurance without denial, and this balance becomes especially significant when the series addresses claims with religious or metaphysical overtones, such as interpretations of the demonic wall as a literal boundary between realms, and the narrator notes how easily such interpretations can resonate with existing belief systems, reinforcing them emotionally even when evidence is weak. And the ethical challenge here is acute, because dismissing such beliefs outright risks alienation, while amplifying them risks harm, and the show navigates this by focusing on mechanisms rather than meanings, explaining how phenomena occur without adjudicating their ultimate significance, allowing viewers to integrate explanations within their own frameworks without coercion, and the narrator recognizes this as a form of respect that does not concede epistemic ground, a delicate balance that requires confidence without arrogance. And Part 8 expands further by considering the ethics of debunking itself, challenging the assumption that exposure of error is inherently virtuous, and the narrator reflects on cases where aggressive debunking humiliates witnesses, reinforcing defensiveness and deepening mistrust, whereas the series' gentler approach preserves dignity, framing misinterpretation as a human tendency rather than a personal failing, and this dignity, he suggests, is crucial for maintaining open channels of communication, because people rarely revise beliefs when they feel attacked, and the proof is out there implicitly understands this psychological reality, structuring its critiques to invite reflection rather than provoke resistance. And this insight resonates with the narrator's broader philosophy of engagement, reinforcing the idea that how we communicate uncertainty matters as much as what we communicate. And Part 8 introduces a poignant contrast by imagining alternative media ecosystems, where anomalies are framed exclusively as threats or revelations, creating cycles of fear and false hope, and the narrator reflects on historical precedents where such framing led to real-world consequences, panic, persecution, misguided policy, and he situates the series as a modest but meaningful corrective to these tendencies, offering a model of restraint that may not dominate but persists, quietly influencing those willing to engage thoughtfully. And this persistence becomes a form of ethical resistance against the acceleration of misinformation, and the narrator considers whether such resistance can scale, whether calm voices can compete with sensational ones, and while he does not offer easy answers, he suggests that cumulative exposure to responsible inquiry can shape norms over time, gradually shifting expectations about how mysteries should be presented and discussed. And Part 8 also turns the ethical lens inward, as the narrator interrogates his own project, questioning whether transforming the series into a novelistic exploration risks aestheticizing uncertainty in ways that could mislead or over-romanticize, and he confronts this risk directly, resolving to foreground process, context, and humility rather than spectacle. And this self-interrogation reinforces the meta-narrative running through the text, the parallel evolution of investigator and storyteller, and as the section unfolds, the narrator recounts a moment from the series where an expert explicitly warns against extrapolating beyond the data, a rare instance of direct ethical guidance embedded within analysis, and this moment strikes him as emblematic of the show's deeper mission, to cultivate not belief or disbelief but discernment. And he reflects on how discernment differs from skepticism alone, incorporating empathy, context, and awareness of cognitive bias, and this distinction becomes central to Part 8's conclusion, as the narrator argues that the true ethical contribution of the proof is out there lies not in resolving mysteries but in modeling discernment as a practice, a habit of mind that can be applied wherever uncertainty arises, and he suggests that in a world saturated with ambiguous information, discernment is a civic virtue as vital as literacy, enabling individuals to navigate complexity without succumbing to fear or cynicism, and the anomalies from Falcon 9 to the demonic wall become teaching tools rather than endpoints, means rather than messages, and as Part 8 draws to a close, the narrator envisions a viewer finishing an episode not with heightened anxiety or smug certainty but with a sharpened awareness of how easily perception can be shaped and how carefully it must be handled, and this outcome, he believes, represents an ethical success, subtle but profound, and he recognizes that such success is fragile, easily overshadowed by louder narratives, yet worth pursuing nonetheless, because ethical storytelling does not promise control over interpretation but commits to integrity in presentation, and this commitment, repeated over time, can cultivate a healthier relationship with the unknown, one grounded in curiosity, caution, and care rather than fear or exploitation. And so Part 8 ends with the narrator affirming that the greatest mystery addressed by the proof is out there may not be any single anomaly but the question of how societies choose to engage with uncertainty itself, whether as an opportunity for growth or a trigger for division. And he senses that this question will lead naturally into the next phase of the narrative, where ethics intersect with identity, belief, and coexistence in even more intimate ways. Part 9 moves inward toward identity, exploring how repeated engagement with mystery reshapes not just opinions but self-understanding, because after ethics and humility have been established as guiding principles, the narrator begins to notice subtle changes in how individuals define themselves in relation to what they know, what they doubt, and what they are willing to leave unresolved. And the proof is out there becomes in this section a mirror rather than a window, reflecting back the viewer's epistemic posture. And the narrator opens by observing how people often introduce themselves implicitly through their stance toward anomalies, as believers, skeptics, agnostics, rationalists, intuitives, each label carrying emotional and social weight. And he reflects on how these identities can harden over time, transforming flexible positions into fixed personas that resist challenge not because of evidence but because of self-coherence. And this insight reframes many heated debates around unexplained phenomena as identity conflicts rather than factual disagreements, because to concede a point can feel like a threat to self-narrative. And the proof is out there, by avoiding identity-affirming language, quietly disrupts this dynamic, refusing to categorize viewers or witnesses, instead inviting them into a process that does not demand allegiance. And Part 9 examines the psychological relief this can offer, particularly to those who feel trapped between communities, unwilling to embrace extreme skepticism or uncritical belief. And the narrator imagines such a viewer, someone who finds comfort in the show's refusal to force a choice, its allowance for partial understanding. And this allowance becomes a form of permission to inhabit uncertainty without shame. And the narrator recognizes how rare this permission is in contemporary discourse, where confidence is often rewarded more than accuracy and certainty more than reflection. And this rarity amplifies the series' quiet significance, and Part 9 deepens by exploring how identity formation around mystery intersects with broader cultural narratives, such as distrust of institutions, valorization of outsider knowledge, and the romanticization of hidden truths. And the narrator traces how these narratives can be empowering, offering a sense of agency and insight, while also carrying risks, fostering oppositional identities that define themselves primarily against perceived deception. And the proof is out there navigates this terrain carefully, validating the impulse to question without endorsing the assumption that questioning must always lead to contrarian conclusions. And this nuance becomes central to the narrator's evolving self-concept, as he recognizes his own attraction to the role of the questioning outsider, a role that flatters intellect and independence. Yet he also sees how easily it can slide into reflexive doubt, where skepticism becomes an identity rather than a method. And this self-critique marks a maturation within the narrative, as the narrator learns to separate critical thinking from performative skepticism, embracing inquiry as a practice rather than a badge. And Part 9 illustrates this shift through a return to earlier cases, now viewed through a different lens, where the narrator notices details he previously overlooked, not because new information has emerged, but because his interpretive stance has softened, allowing complexity rather than forcing resolution. And this softening is mirrored in the series itself, which often revisits familiar categories, natural, technological, human error, without locking them into rigid hierarchies, acknowledging overlap and interaction. And the narrator begins to see identity not as a fixed position, but as a dynamic process shaped by ongoing engagement with evidence and uncertainty. And this perspective extends to collective identity as well, as he reflects on how societies define themselves through their relationship with the unknown, whether as conquerors of mystery, victims of hidden forces, or participants in an unfolding exploration. And he suggests that the proof is out there implicitly advocates for the third identity, framing humanity as a learning system rather than a knowing authority. And this framing carries ethical and political implications, encouraging patience, cooperation, and openness rather than fear-driven reaction. And Part 9 explores these implications by imagining how anomalous claims intersect with public policy, security, and collective decision-making, noting how identity-driven interpretations can escalate tensions, while process-oriented interpretations can de-escalate them. And although the series does not address policy directly, its modeling of careful analysis contributes indirectly to a culture better equipped to handle ambiguity in high-stakes contexts. And the narrator finds this contribution both subtle and profound, reinforcing his sense that the series' true impact lies beyond entertainment. And Part 9 also returns to the demonic wall as an identity marker, observing how for some it becomes a symbol of spiritual warfare, for others a cautionary tale about visual misinterpretation, and for still others a media artifact illustrating algorithmic amplification. And the narrator notes that none of these identities is purely irrational, each arising from broader frameworks of meaning. And the challenge lies not in erasing these frameworks but in preventing them from becoming impermeable. And the proof is out there, by repeatedly presenting multiple perspectives without endorsing a singular narrative, keeps permeability alive, allowing viewers to shift without losing face. And this quality becomes central to the narrator's appreciation, as he recognizes how often discourse traps individuals in positions they no longer fully endorse. And as Part 9 unfolds, the narrator reflects on his own readers, imagining how they might approach this novel, some seeking affirmation of skepticism, others drawn by the allure of mystery. and he resolves to resist tailoring the narrative to any single identity, instead maintaining fidelity to process, humility, and ethical engagement, even if this choice limits mass appeal. And this resolution parallels the show's own trajectory, prioritizing integrity over sensational reach. And Part 9 reaches its emotional core when the narrator recounts a quiet moment of self-recognition, realizing that his engagement with the unknown has shifted from a need to define himself against mystery to a willingness to be shaped by it, not passively but dialogically, allowing questions to refine his understanding without demanding immediate closure. And this shift brings a sense of ease, a release from the pressure to perform certainty or doubt, and he recognizes this ease as a form of intellectual freedom, one that The Proof Is Out There has helped cultivate through repetition rather than revelation. And as the section approaches its conclusion, the narrator frames identity not as a stance toward mystery, but as a capacity to remain open, revisable, and attentive, and he suggests that this capacity may be the most adaptive trait in a world where information outpaces comprehension, and anomalies will continue to emerge regardless of our readiness. And so Part 9 ends with the narrator standing at a crossroads of identity, no longer asking whether he is a believer or skeptic, but whether he is willing to engage responsibly with uncertainty, and he answers this question affirmatively, recognizing that such engagement does not weaken identity but enriches it, grounding self-understanding in process rather than position. And he senses that this internal realignment prepares the way for the final movements of the narrative, where mystery, meaning, and coexistence converge in broader philosophical reflections. Part 10 widens the lens once more, moving from personal and collective identity toward the question of coexistence, not between humans and hypothetical unknown forces, but between different ways of knowing that must share the same cultural space. Because after tracing how mystery reshapes self-understanding, the narrator begins to ask whether a society can sustain multiple epistemologies without collapsing into conflict. And The Proof Is Out There becomes, in this part, a quiet experiment in pluralism, demonstrating how scientific reasoning, experiential testimony, cultural symbolism, and emotional response can be presented side by side without being forced into a false hierarchy. And the narrator opens by observing how rare such coexistence has become in a media environment that rewards binary framing, true or false, real or fake, believer or skeptic. And he notes how anomalies are often used as wedges to deepen division, rather than as opportunities to practice coexistence. And this observation frames Part 10 as an exploration of epistemic peace, the conditions under which different interpretations can exist without escalating into mutual delegitimization. And the narrator identifies one of these conditions as procedural agreement, the shared acceptance of methods even when conclusions differ. And The Proof Is Out There models this by foregrounding how conclusions are reached rather than insisting on what they must be, inviting viewers to evaluate reasoning rather than pledge allegiance to outcomes. And this emphasis resonates with the narrator's growing conviction that method matters more than metaphysics in sustaining dialogue. And Part 10 elaborates on this conviction by examining moments in the series where experts explicitly disagree, offering competing interpretations grounded in different disciplinary assumptions, yet do so without hostility, acknowledging uncertainty and overlap. And the narrator contrasts this with public debates where disagreement is often framed as exposure of fraud or ignorance, and he suggests that the show's calm disagreement offers a template for civil epistemic conflict, one where difference does not imply bad faith. And this template becomes increasingly important as societies grapple with complex challenges that resist simple answers. And Part 10 extends this insight by exploring how coexistence with uncertainty mirrors coexistence with diversity more broadly, requiring tolerance for ambiguity, patience with difference, and resistance to absolutism. And the narrator reflects on how fear of the unknown often masks fear of difference, the anxiety that arises when familiar categories fail, and anomalies trigger this anxiety by revealing the limits of our classifications. And The Proof Is Out There, by repeatedly confronting viewers with classification failure, objects that are not easily labeled, phenomena that straddle categories, implicitly trains viewers to sit with ambiguity, a skill transferable to social and cultural contexts. And the narrator sees in this an understated civic function, preparing audiences not just to interpret strange footage but to navigate pluralistic societies. And Part 10 deepens this theme through a meditation on language, noting how terms like demonic, anomaly, unidentified, or unexplained carry different connotations across communities. and the narrator reflects on how the series' careful choice of neutral language acts as a bridge, reducing symbolic escalation and allowing space for multiple readings, and this linguistic restraint becomes a form of coexistence in practice, acknowledging difference without inflaming it, and the narrator recognizes how difficult such restraint is to maintain, especially when dramatic language promises attention and validation, and yet the series' consistency in this regard strengthens its credibility, signaling commitment to process over persuasion, and Part 10 also addresses the coexistence of wonder and skepticism, rejecting the notion that one must extinguish the other, and the narrator recalls moments where experts express genuine awe even as they explain mechanisms, and he notes how these moments validate emotional response without surrendering analytical rigor, demonstrating that wonder does not require belief in the supernatural, and skepticism does not require emotional detachment, and this synthesis becomes central to the narrator's evolving worldview, as he embraces curiosity that is disciplined rather than defensive, and Part 10 explores the social implications of this synthesis, suggesting that communities capable of holding wonder and skepticism together may be more resilient, less prone to panic or dogmatism when confronted with uncertainty, and the narrator situates the proof is out there as a cultural rehearsal for this resilience, offering repeated exposure to ambiguous stimuli framed with care. And this repetition builds familiarity with uncertainty, reducing its threat, and Part 10 also confronts the limits of coexistence, acknowledging that not all interpretations are equally benign, and the narrator reflects on cases where anomalous narratives have been used to justify harm, exclusion, or violence, and he emphasizes that coexistence does not mean uncritical acceptance, but rather a commitment to challenge harmful claims through evidence and dialogue, rather than ridicule or suppression. And the proof is out there embodies this commitment by addressing extreme interpretations without amplifying them, contextualizing rather than sensationalizing, and this approach reinforces the distinction between respect for persons and endorsement of ideas, a distinction often blurred in polarized discourse, and as Part 10 unfolds, the narrator imagines the series as a shared table where different perspectives are invited to sit, not to agree but to listen, and he acknowledges the fragility of this arrangement, easily disrupted by bad faith or performative outrage, yet he argues that its very fragility makes it valuable, because it demonstrates that coexistence is not a default state but an ongoing practice requiring intention and care, and this practice mirrors democratic processes more broadly, where disagreement is inevitable but collapse is not, and the narrator sees in the series a microcosm of this broader challenge, managing disagreement without spectacle, and Part 10 approaches its conclusion by returning to the Falcon 9 imagery one final time in this section, now stripped of its earlier symbolic weight and viewed as a shared reference point across interpretations, a common object of attention that supports multiple readings without demanding uniformity, and this shared attention becomes a metaphor for coexistence itself, different meanings anchored to the same reality, and the narrator suggests that cultivating such shared anchors may be key to navigating a fragmented information landscape. And so, Part 10 ends with a tentative optimism, the belief that coexistence with uncertainty and difference is possible when process is prioritized over certainty, humility over dominance, and dialogue over spectacle, and the proof is out there through its consistent modeling of these values, offers not a solution but a practice, one that can be extended beyond anomalies into everyday life, shaping how we engage with complexity, disagreement, and the unknown, and the narrator senses that the narrative is nearing its final synthesis, where these threads of humility, ethics, identity, and coexistence will converge into a broader reflection on meaning itself. Part 11 turns toward meaning, not as a fixed conclusion extracted from mystery, but as something emergent that arises through sustained engagement with the unknown. And after coexistence has been framed as a social and epistemic practice, the narrator now asks what, if anything, such practice ultimately offers to the human search for significance, because beneath questions of rockets, walls, shadows, and unexplained signals lies a quieter inquiry about why humans are so persistently drawn to anomalies in the first place, and the proof is out there, viewed through this lens, becomes less a series about phenomena and more a meditation on meaning-making itself, and the narrator opens by reflecting on how meaning has historically been imposed from above, through myth, religion, ideology, or grand scientific narratives, each offering coherence at the cost of flexibility, and he contrasts this with the series' refusal to impose a final explanatory frame, noting how this refusal initially feels unsatisfying, even unsettling, to viewers conditioned to expect closure. Yet over time this lack of resolution begins to function differently, creating space for personal interpretation that is not prescribed but cultivated. And Part 11 explores this transition from imposed meaning to participatory meaning, where significance is not delivered but discovered through engagement, reflection, and dialogue, and the narrator recognizes this as a subtle but profound shift, one that mirrors broader cultural movements away from authoritative narratives toward decentralized sense-making. And he acknowledges both the promise and the peril of this shift, because while participatory meaning empowers individuals, it also places greater responsibility on them to navigate uncertainty without falling into nihilism or dogma. And The Proof is Out There occupies an interesting middle ground here, offering structure without doctrine, guidance without prescription, and this balance becomes central to the narrator's appreciation, as he sees how the series provides a scaffold for meaning without dictating its content. And Part 11 delves deeper by examining how repeated exposure to unresolved anomalies changes the emotional texture of inquiry, noting how initial excitement often gives way to frustration, then to acceptance, and finally to a quieter form of curiosity that is less urgent but more durable. And the narrator likens this progression to a maturation process, where the desire for definitive answers evolves into a capacity to live well with partial understanding. And he reflects on how rare this capacity is encouraged in contemporary culture, which often equates meaning with certainty and resolution. And the series' countercultural insistence on ambiguity thus becomes a training ground for a different relationship with meaning, one that is provisional, revisable, and context-sensitive. And Part 11 also addresses the existential dimension of this relationship, as the narrator considers how anomalies confront humans with their cognitive and perceptual limits, reminding them that reality exceeds available models, and rather than interpreting this excess as a threat, he suggests that it can be experienced as an invitation, a call to humility that does not diminish human worth, but reframes it, positioning humanity not as master of reality, but as participant within it. And this reframing carries existential implications, shifting meaning away from domination and control toward curiosity and care. And The Proof is Out There, by repeatedly showing experts admit uncertainty without embarrassment, normalizes this posture, modeling a dignity grounded in honesty rather than omniscience. And the narrator finds this deeply resonant, especially in a cultural moment where confidence is often mistaken for competence. And Part 11 weaves this existential reflection with narrative continuity by revisiting earlier motifs, including the demonic wall, now reinterpreted not as a puzzle to be solved but as a catalyst that revealed how easily humans project meaning onto ambiguous stimuli. And the narrator does not dismiss this projection as foolish, instead recognizing it as a fundamental human impulse, the same impulse that generates art, myth, and science. And the question becomes not whether humans will project meaning, but how consciously and responsibly they do so. And The Proof is Out There contributes to this responsibility by slowing the interpretive process, inserting analysis between perception and conclusion. And this slowing down becomes, in Part 11, a moral as well as cognitive act, creating space for reflection before reaction. And the narrator suggests that such space is essential for meaning that is sustainable rather than reactive. And Part 11 further explores how meaning emerges relationally, not only between humans and phenomena but among viewers themselves, as shared engagement with anomalies creates communities of inquiry that, at their best, are bound not by shared beliefs but by shared questions. And the narrator reflects on forums, discussions, and private conversations sparked by the series, noting how these interactions often reveal as much about participants' values and fears as about the phenomena under discussion. And he suggests that meaning arises in these relational spaces, where individuals articulate, challenge, and revise their interpretations in dialogue with others. And this relational meaning contrasts with solitary consumption of definitive narratives, offering a more dynamic and resilient sense of significance. And The Proof is Out There, by leaving interpretive gaps, actively invites such relational engagement. And Part 11 also confronts the anxiety that accompanies open-ended meaning, acknowledging that not everyone finds comfort in ambiguity. And the narrator reflects on his own moments of discomfort, the temptation to impose closure, to declare a final answer simply to relieve tension, and he recognizes this temptation as deeply human. Yet he also recognizes how often premature closure forecloses richer understanding. And the series' discipline in resisting this temptation becomes, for him, an ethical lesson, one applicable beyond anomalies to relationships, politics, and self-understanding. And Part 11 articulates this lesson as a call to patience, the willingness to let meaning unfold over time rather than demanding immediate coherence. And the narrator frames patience not as passivity, but as active engagement sustained without certainty. And this framing redefines meaning as something lived rather than concluded. And as Part 11 moves toward its closing movement, the narrator situates the proof is out there within a longer human tradition of grappling with the unknown, from ancient stargazing to modern data analysis, suggesting that what distinguishes contemporary inquiry is not the disappearance of mystery, but the multiplication of explanatory tools. And yet despite these tools, mystery persists, and meaning remains something negotiated rather than discovered once and for all. And the narrator finds reassurance in this persistence, seeing it as evidence that meaning is not a finite resource to be exhausted, but an ongoing process renewed with each generation. And the proof is out there, in its modest way, participates in this renewal, offering a contemporary ritual of inquiry that honors both knowledge and its limits. And Part 11 ends on a reflective note, with the narrator acknowledging that the series has altered his understanding of meaning itself, shifting it from an endpoint to a practice, from an answer to a relationship. And he senses that this realization prepares the ground for the final part, where meaning, mystery, and humanity's future orientation toward the unknown will converge into a concluding synthesis. Part 12 arrives not as a conclusion that closes the circle, but as a widening that releases it, because after identity, coexistence, and meaning have been examined as practices shaped by sustained engagement with mystery, the narrator now turns toward futurity, asking how humanity's relationship with the unknown might evolve, and what kind of ethical, intellectual, and emotional orientation will be required to inhabit a world where anomalies do not disappear but proliferate. And the proof is out. There becomes, in this final movement, less a subject than a companion, a reference point that has quietly trained the narrator, and by extension the reader, to approach the future with calibrated curiosity rather than fear or triumphalism. And the narrator opens by reflecting on how technological acceleration ensures that uncertainty will only deepen, as sensors multiply, data volumes expand, and interpretation lags behind detection, creating an environment where more is seen but less is immediately understood. And he notes how this condition mirrors the structure of the series itself, where evidence often exceeds explanation. And the question is no longer whether mystery exists but how humans choose to live alongside it. And Part 12 frames this choice as foundational, shaping not only scientific progress but cultural stability, because responses to uncertainty tend to cascade into broader patterns of trust, governance, and collective imagination. And the narrator suggests that the proof is out there models a future-oriented stance grounded in humility, procedural rigor, and ethical restraint, qualities that will be increasingly necessary as boundaries between the known and unknown blur. And he reflects on how earlier epochs often responded to mystery with myth or domination, while modernity attempted to dissolve it through mastery. And yet neither approach has proven sufficient, because mystery adapts, relocating itself at the edges of comprehension. And this persistence reframes mystery not as a problem to be eliminated, but as a condition to be navigated. And the narrator argues that accepting this condition does not mean abandoning progress but redefining it, shifting emphasis from total explanation to adaptive understanding. And the proof is out there exemplifies this shift by valuing incremental clarification without promising final answers. And Part 12 deepens by examining the moral dimension of futurity, noting how responses to anomalies can shape how societies allocate attention, resources, and care. And the narrator considers scenarios where fear-driven interpretations lead to exclusion or aggression, contrasted with process-driven interpretations that foster collaboration and resilience. And although the series does not dramatize such outcomes, its methodological calm implicitly favors the latter path, and the narrator sees this as a quiet ethical intervention, encouraging viewers to resist panic and projection. And this Resistance becomes increasingly important in a world where misinformation can amplify uncertainty into crisis. And Part 12 also revisits the emotional arc traced throughout the narrative, from fascination to doubt to humility to meaning, and now to responsibility, because having learned to sit with uncertainty, the narrator asks what obligations arise from this capacity, and he suggests that one obligation is to model epistemic patience in public discourse, to demonstrate that not knowing is not a failure but a starting point, and another obligation is to protect the dignity of inquiry, resisting both ridicule and exploitation of the unknown. And The Proof Is Out There contributes to this protection by maintaining boundaries around speculation, neither suppressing curiosity nor indulging sensationalism. And the narrator acknowledges how difficult this balance is to sustain, particularly as attention economies reward extremes. And yet he argues that the future of responsible inquiry depends on precisely this discipline, and Part 12 extends this argument to education, imagining how exposure to unresolved cases might train future generations to think probabilistically, to weigh evidence, to tolerate ambiguity, and to revise conclusions without shame. And the narrator contrasts this with pedagogies that prioritize right answers over good questions, suggesting that the latter are ill-suited to an era of rapid change. And The Proof Is Out There, though not an educational program in the formal sense, functions pedagogically by repeatedly demonstrating how experts think rather than what they think. And this demonstration becomes part of the narrator's vision for a future culture of inquiry, one that values transparency of method over performance of certainty. And Part 12 also engages with the spiritual dimension of futurity, carefully distinguishing between institutional belief and existential orientation. And the narrator reflects on how mystery has historically provided a gateway to transcendence, and how modern skepticism has sometimes stripped this gateway bare, leaving a sense of disenchantment. And yet he suggests that a renewed relationship with mystery need not revive dogma to restore depth, because awe can coexist with analysis, and reverence can be directed toward process rather than doctrine. And the proof is out there, by allowing moments of wonder without sacralizing explanation, gestures toward this possibility, offering a secular reverence grounded in honesty, and the narrator finds this gesture personally meaningful, as it allows him to experience depth without surrendering critical thought. And Part 12 weaves this personal resonance into a broader reflection on collective imagination, asking what stories humanity will tell about itself as it moves forward, conqueror of the unknown, victim of hidden forces, or co-explorer within a vast and partially intelligible reality. And the narrator advocates for the third story, arguing that it aligns best with the ethical and epistemic lessons traced throughout the narrative, and he positions The Proof Is Out There as a modest but important contributor to this story, reinforcing an image of humanity as curious, fallible, and capable of learning without domination. And Part 12 also confronts the inevitability of unresolved questions, acknowledging that some anomalies may never be fully explained, either due to lost data, technological limits, or inherent complexity. And the narrator insists that this inevitability should not be framed as defeat, because the value of inquiry lies not solely in resolution, but in the practices it cultivates: patience, rigor, humility, dialogue, and care. And these practices persist regardless of outcome. And The Proof Is Out There, by centering practice over conclusion, ensures that even unresolved cases contribute to growth rather than stagnation. And as Part 12 approaches its closing movement, the narrator returns one final time to the Falcon 9 imagery, now entirely stripped of spectacle and fear, seen instead as a marker of shared attention, a moment when many gazed upward and asked questions. And he reflects on how such moments reveal both the limits and the possibilities of human understanding. And he suggests that the future will contain many such moments, not only in the sky but in data streams, social systems, and inner lives. And the challenge will be to meet them with the orientation cultivated throughout this narrative. And Part 12 concludes with a quiet affirmation that living responsibly with the unknown is not a temporary stance but an enduring condition, one that demands ongoing practice rather than final answers. And the narrator expresses gratitude, not for certainty achieved, but for the discipline learned, recognizing that this discipline equips him to face whatever mysteries emerge next. And he leaves the reader with an open horizon rather than a closed door, emphasizing that the Proof is not simply out there, waiting to be found, but also within the practices humans choose to uphold as they search. And in this recognition, the narrative finds its resolution, not as an ending, but as a readiness to continue.